In April 1963, the Beatles played a concert like no other to an almost entirely male audience at Stowe boarding school. One of the boys, John Bloomfield, quietly recorded it and kept the tape for 60 years till he decided to reveal it.
They did a little bit of tuning up. And then he comes forward to the microphone and he says, "Hello, hello, who's your lady friend?" And there's a tiny pause and the upper class audience titters because none of them had really heard that song before, but they knew it was funny in some sort of way. For him, it would have been normal end of the pier stuff, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
But there's just that little pause. He sings it and then the stoics sort of, oh, frightfully funny.
And then you're away.
And then we're away. 1, 2, 3, 4, bang.
John, we're trying to recreate the level of sounds that you experienced in that concert by playing your clip through the loudspeaker system in the Roxy Theatre now. And you've been told by the engineer to put your volume up to maximum.
We are turning it up to 11. Probably that was about the quality we heard it out, actually. I don't suspect we probably heard it much better than that.
We've heard so much over the years about how incredible the Beatles were as a live group, all those years of performing the supposed 10,000 hours in the clubs in Hamburg.
Here we have at Stowe then doing some of those, what we think of as BBC numbers, a shot of rhythm and blues, Memphis, Tennessee.
Tell me about this. They basically are taking requests. I've never heard anything like it.
Boys shout out, do please please me or something, and so they do please please me.
John Bloomfield, who obviously made the recording, was listening to it with us when he played it to us, said actually if you listen carefully you can hear these terribly cut glass accents going, "A taste of honey!"
Oh, yeah, taste of honey. Taste of honey. Oh, taste of honey.
I thought that was interesting for what it reveals about how well known their music was, considering there was no commercial pop radio easily available. Listening to Radio Luxembourg on your radio at night was done quite illicitly at that school. The album has only come out a week earlier, while some of these boys seem to know the band's music.
I didn't even know this tape existed until you told me about it the other day, and I think I had to pick myself up off the floor. I'm used to surprises, but some days the surprises are bigger than others, and that was a particularly memorable phone call from you.
When Julian was 3 weeks old, Brian invited John to go to Spain with him. John asked if I'd mind, and I said, truthfully, that I wouldn't. I was preoccupied with Julian and nowhere near ready to travel. But I knew how much John needed a break where he wouldn't be recognised and could really relax. I gave them my blessing, and they went off together for 12 days. It was a holiday John came to regret, because it sparked off a string of rumours about his relationship with Brian. He had to put up with sly digs, winks, and innuendo that he was secretly gay. It infuriated him. All he'd wanted was a break with a friend, but it was turned into so much more. A few weeks after he got back, Paul had his 21st birthday party in his aunt's back garden. The Beatles had just finished another national tour, this time with Jerry and the Pacemakers and Roy Orbison. They had also released a third single, From Me to You, which again went straight to number 1. At the party, the boys' old friend, Bob Wooler, the Cavern MC, made a crack to John about his holiday. John, who'd had plenty to drink, exploded. He leapt on Bob, and by the time he was dragged off, Bob had a black eye and badly bruised ribs. I took John home as fast as I could, and Brian drove Bob to the hospital. I was appalled that John had lashed out again. I'd thought those days were over. But John was still livid. muttering that Bob had called him a queer. A day or two later, when he had cooled down, he was ashamed. He kept repeating, "Oh, Godsin, what have I done?" He sent Bob a telegram saying, "Really sorry, Bob. Stop. Terribly worried to realise what I had done. Stop. What more can I say? John Lennon." Unfortunately, the local press got hold of the story, and the Daily Mirror ran it, which didn't help John's image. He swore he'd never do anything like it again, and to my knowledge he didn't, certainly for as long as we were together.
Sim was having a baby, and the holiday was planned, but I wasn't going to break the holiday for a baby, you know. That's what a bastard I was. And I just went on holiday, you know, and I watched Brian picking up the boys, you know. I liked playing a bit faggy, you know, and all that, but it was enjoyable. But there was big rumours in Liverpool. It was terrible. Very embarrassing. Oh, fuck knows. Yeah. Yes. I was pretty close to Brian because if somebody's going to manage me, I want to know them inside out. And there was a period when he told me he was a fag and all that. I introduced him to pills, you know, which gives me a guilt association for his death. I mean, they go that way anyway. To make him talk, you know, to find out what he's like. Glass onion. John Lennon.
Hello everybody, welcome to episode 93 of Glass Onion on John Lennon. We are just about making our way to the 100. Give me a few more months, folks, and we'll get there. And today we have the welcome return of Beatles author royalty, Sir Ken McNab. Okay, he hasn't actually been knighted yet, but no, Ken McNab. Really nice to have you back, Ken. How are you?
I'm very well, Antony. Thank you very much for that lovely and warm welcome. It's great to talk to you again. Brilliant.
Yeah, a bit creepy though, wasn't it? Well, I'm feeling a bit nostalgic today, not just for the bygone era of 1963, although I wasn't born then, but the last time you were on was July 2019, when Glass Onion was about 6 months old. It was just a baby then, and now we're basically 4.5 years. I have got some bad news for you. I don't want to start on a downer, but unfortunately we're not going to be doing 4.5 hours this time.
No, there's no truth in the rumour, Antony. Some people are still trying to get to the end of it.
Yeah, some people are still listening, yeah, but I know you were planning to blow your entire evening talking to me, but I'm really sorry.
No, you're fine.
I won't tell this whole story again, because I've told this story a few times over the 4 years since I saw you, but basically your last book, well, the last one, and in the end, the one about 1969, was month by month, and basically we'd done about 2 hours and got to May. And I thought, we can't just say, oh yeah, and some stuff happened in June and then July, and then they broke up. So we had to see it out to the end. But thank you for that. You're a good sport. Just very quickly, I just got to tell the listeners one thing. If you're wondering where the 1967 shows are, I did announce the last time that was going to be the next show. That will be the next show after this, because Ken and his publisher kindly sent me a lovely hardback copy of your latest book. It's one of the perks of this podcasting. I don't make any money, but every now and again I get a lovely shiny book in the post. So there you go. So Shake It Up, Baby, The Rise of Beatlemania and the Mayhem of 1963.
I actually did the cover myself as well. I quite like the cover. I've got a picture of that Palladium. I'm very small. I wasn't sure. I did want to add in a picture of the fans, but I was persuaded not to. No, I think it looks okay. So it looks quite nice, yeah.
Yeah, so for people who haven't seen it, it's the famous doorway shot. That's from the Palladium, isn't it?
Yeah.
October. And then you've got the Shake It Up Baby in white against the blue brickwork, basically, isn't it? Very nice. Yeah.
When I was a production journalist, I always liked having pictures and you could build the background and put the headline on it and the house. So.
Yes.
No, I'll tell you, it's funny, actually, in a previous life, Antony, I used to pretend I was the literary editor of the Glasgow Herald in order to get all sorts of freebies. All sorts of things, they always come in at Christmas, you know. Hello, my name's Ken McNab and it was a treat, yeah.
No, I loved it. I did your book in 12 days, just 1 month per day. Perfect. Now, I would like to sort of just segue a little bit from the last time. Last time you were on, we were talking about Get Back, because, of course, Get Back hadn't landed at that point. I think it was meant to land in 2020, and then for obvious reasons it didn't. And then we finally got it at the end of November. Your line last time was, you can't reheat a souffle. So I've got two questions for you. Number one, did Peter Jackson reheat the souffle? And number 2, did we learn anything that's definitive, or do you still feel like it's an edit of the hours we had? You can answer those 2 questions in any order you like.
Well, with regard to reheating a souffle, I mean, I did enjoy Get Back. It was great to see them in that environment and the scenario. As to reheating a souffle, I was a bit concerned, that he had access to footage and information that we mere mortals didn't have. You're relying on your own research. You're relying on the people you spoke to who were, as I say, eyewitnesses to history. So there was always a concern that what actually unfolded is completely different from your own research. But I have to say, I really don't think it was. I don't want to sound too much like a heretic, but I thought it was too long. I thought to have to wade through. I mean, there's some brilliant moments in it, some genuine highlights of the band's career and of them at that particular time. But having said that, there's an awful lot of navel-gazing as well. There were some genuinely fascinating moments. One that stood out for me, there was a conversation between George Harrison and John Lennon, which had obviously been picked up by one of these mics hidden in a plant pot. And this was obviously the day after Lennon had met Alan Klein for the first time. And Lennon's very enthusiastic about it. He's very passionate about it. And I wish I'd found that piece of audio, because it might have helped to provide some context. But in essence, there was not an awful lot in it that made me think that really the traditional view of Get Back is that they were in a very bad place. And although there are some great moments of camaraderie, my overall impression is that they were still in a bad place. And I think that becomes abundantly clear within a few short months after Get Back concluded. If you take the picture session at Tittenhurst, they're clearly miserable. And they've clearly reached the end of the road. And the end of the road, thankfully, was Abbey Road to go out in such a high. But, I just felt that Get Back was brilliant and a bit of a curate's egg. To see Paul McCartney create the actual song Get Back out of the ether is mind-boggling. And it's just a testament to his genius, really. It's an awesome thing to watch a song like that take shape. For me, I think that was one of the great highlights. But, the rooftop session looked brilliant. The actual cinematography and the clarity of the film was really sensational. And to see John in that context and George was just fantastic. Felt a bit sorry for George. Pretty evident that he was being squeezed from both sides. I thought Billy Preston was absolutely sensational. Provided a lovely balm to all the tension, an antidote, if you like. But musicianship was, of course, tremendous. So much as I loved it, I thought it was great. I'm not too sure I could watch it all again, actually. I didn't think it was too long, but intercut with some moments of epic enjoyment, really.
I think with the length, I understand what you mean. If you're thinking of it in terms of a story, it's obviously very, very long drawn out. But I remember saying on the show many times that I decided that I wasn't really too worried about the narrative and about whether we were going to get the truth. I mean, the truth is obviously elusive. I'd already listened to the Nagra tapes. I just decided I was going to revel in the footage, and that's why I couldn't get enough of it. So as a coherent piece of work, maybe 8 hours is a bit much, but I could easily do another 8, because after a while I wasn't really so focused on, is this changing my mind about what I thought? Because I'd sort of taken a bit of a detached view of that.
There's some moments of genuine poignancy. I mean, you have to feel for McCartney when you see him gamely trying to hold all these strands together. And he looks close to tears at a couple of points, because it's quite clear that, he's losing his best friend, he's losing his band. You can see that he's swimming against the tide, and no matter how hard he tries to accommodate everybody, it's just not working. And, it's interesting to see the dynamic between them. It's interesting to see the dynamic between John and Yoko, Paul and Linda. Ringo is just as we'll expect Ringo to be. Maybe this is like a white album argument, Antony, that should it have been 2 albums or should it have been 1? Well, I actually prefer the 2 albums, obviously. Maybe what I need to do, Antony, is revisit it like yourself. And I'm quite sure if I revisited it again, I would perhaps take a different view that, in fact, it's much better to see it as one single entity, as you said, rather than worry about some of the, the bits that go a bit stale in between. I mean, at the end of the day, I suppose what really matters is you're seeing the Beatles, you're seeing footage that we've never seen before, and everybody, if you're a fan, warms to that.
Yeah, I mean, I've watched it 3 times, which might seem like a lot, but I know people in the Beatles community who've watched it far more than that. But yeah, I think if you watched it, say, once a year or something, you probably would, because of the length, you'd get something out of it every single time, I'm pretty sure.
I mean, I'm a huge Peter Jackson fan. I mean, this Ken's cavern here is littered with Lord of the Rings memorabilia.
Oh, yeah, I remember from last time, actually.
Yeah, my son's just moved out, and he's left me his magnificent Lord of the Rings poster, which was signed by Billy Boyd and a couple of things. So I mean, kudos to and respect to Peter Jackson for sitting through it patiently and pulling together all those loose threads to form this brilliant narrative tapestry, really.
Yeah, and in fact, he's got... Yeah, it's not. We could probably spend 2 hours talking about Get Back, couldn't we? But all I was going to say was he's actually got a few more hours that are actually done and edited. And he was encouraging. He went on one Beatles podcast. I think it was Things We Said Today. I think he did about 4 hours on there, and he was actually saying that the Beatles fans should start a campaign to get the rest of it released.
The rest of it, yeah.
So I mean,
you know, millions out there like yourself, Antony. You can't get enough of it. So who am I?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just. I suppose I don't spread my net very wide these days. I know what my favourites are, and the Beatles are obviously, because of this podcast, they're just always there. And it's not that I necessarily listen to their music that much, because I don't really need to. It's already in my head, and it comes up anyway all the time. The other question was just, did we learn anything definitive, or do you feel like it's still an edit of something much longer?
I think it provides an extended snapshot of the period. I don't think it changes the nuance or the context of the period. My overarching impression is that they were on the cusp of breaking up. You know, they weren't the same band of brothers they were still a band of brothers, but maybe there wasn't quite the same closeness that there was obviously during the touring years and even post-touring years, because, you know, their lives are going in different directions, and also the music scene is changing. You know, there's a lot of things to take into account. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's the Beatles' bloody Get Back, and maybe we should just be thankful for that.
Yeah, Ken's just quoting Paul McCartney there. He's talking about the White Album in the anthology, wasn't it? It's the bloody Beatles' White Album. Shut up.
Exactly. Yeah, shut up.
Right, the Band of Brothers thing was a perfect segue to 1963, but I do have one little question for you. You wrote another book. Since we last met, you've written another book called You Started It, about rock feuds. And I love the title because it makes... I was wondering whether the title referred to how childish maybe a lot of these feuds were. You know, you started it. I've just got one question. Which did you find what's the bitterest feud that you found in rock music? Because I've written one down, but I didn't ask you in advance. What were the worst ones, do you think?
The worst one is, by some distance, the Pink Floyd one between Dave Gilmour and Roger Waters. It's in a league of its own, and it still festers to this day. Simon and Garfunkel and The Clash, you know, they all had their moments. The Everly Brothers had some terrible moments. Fleetwood Mac, obviously.
Oh, yeah, of course.
And you would maybe consider Oasis, but Pink Floyd is the feud that just never ends. I mean, these guys are now in their late 70s, and this pernicious feud shows no sign of abating. You know, one comment from Roger Waters is enough to pour kerosene onto the fire. And I mean, Dave Gilmour's wife got involved, Polly Sampson, she got involved. And, you know, unfortunately, Roger can't help himself. Sometimes he just foams at the mouth. Magnificent musician though he is, and Pink Floyd being one of the greatest bands of all time without any question. But you know, I quite like the feuds in bands. You know, and for some people it acts like an accelerant. You know, and it provides a stimulus and an impetus. But at the same time, it can be very, very dark.
Yeah, I mean, Rumours is the obvious example of literally creating art while it's happening. But I'm going to show you my notes there. Waters and Gilmour. Oh, no, you can't see me, can you? Sorry, I forgot.
No, I'll take your word for it.
No, I'll take my word for it. I wrote down Waters and Gilmour. I've got here, they obviously got together for Live 8, and they were all pleased that they got together before, what's the keyboardist? Rick Wright, isn't it? Richard Wright. Before he died. And if you watch the footage, Roger's really into it. And I think he had some idea that they were going to become mates again, but...
I mean, that's why I always think with the Beatles, they stepped off the page at the right time. Some of these bands could have gone on forever and ever. And, you know, I don't want to say the Stones because the forthcoming record might actually be good, but I still don't think there's any relevance to them, you know. Pink Floyd had their Day in the Sun, and it was quite a lengthy Day in the Sun, but you can't go back.
Yeah, they are feuding over the website and it's really the name, the brand, isn't it? And I find a lot of rock bands, I don't know if you found this when you were doing your book, two of the things that they always seem to fight about, I mean, obviously there's probably drugs and women and all that, but song royalties and the brand, because Pink Floyd is obviously a brand, and it's sad to think that it started from Syd Barrett taking the names of two blues singers and saying, oh, let's call it Pink Floyd, and then decades later they're reduced to this, you know. It's sad, isn't it, really?
Yeah, the legal fallout is really disappointing for a lot of fans, and as I say, it leads to this absolutely pernicious feud. I mean, the only other one I can think of in that context is Ray Davies and Dave Davies and the Kinks. You know, I think down through the decades, they've had their moments, but they've never really patched it up. And, one loose sentence and all of a sudden the powder meets the keg and boom.
I think from what I read, theirs started from when Dave was born. It was one of those.
Exactly.
It was one of those ones where the older brother, as soon as the younger brother's born, it's just like daggers from day one, you know.
I did enjoy that book. I loved writing it. I thought the stories were great. And as with all the Beatles stuff, it's not enough just to rely on already published material. So I really worked hard to speak to engineers and, as I say, people who were in the various bands in their orbit at the time who could provide some context to the stories and also knock them down if they weren't true. And the title, Antony, is that very Glaswegian thing to say, you started it.
But was it supposed to refer to the fact that they're quite childish sometimes, or was it just...
There's an element of that, finger pointing, blame game, that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. Right, so let's get to 1963. If you can think back to 69, and we're just going to do a little comparison here. I know it'd be easier to compare forward, wouldn't it, from 63 to 69. Of the four, who do you think changed the most in those 6 years? I know we're having to go back from 69 to 73.
I think it would have to be John. You could make a case for all of them. I'm going to go for John, having undergone a serious personal and professional transformation in that time. You could easily say the same about George Harrison, but I'll stick with John because I'm a John guy. And the John Lennon of 1969, in so many respects, bears absolutely no resemblance to the boy who was hanging over the banister in Manchester Square in 1963 for the cover of the first album. I mean, they all changed out of all recognition, but I think John, in terms of his personality and his intellect, was the one who underwent a profound change.
That was a good answer for Glass Onion as well, Ken. Thanks. Good answer for this podcast. No, I mean, I guess the popular answer is George, isn't it, really? But I would say George or John, personally. I think it's interesting, isn't it, that the physical change reflects all the other changes. There's an amazing clip. I don't know if you've seen this. I think it ended up on TikTok or it's on YouTube as a short. Have you ever seen the clip of him in 69 watching the Some Other Guy clip?
I don't know if I have seen that.
I'll have to send that to you.
I've seen him watching a clip of this boy, I think.
Oh, that's George, watching it in 1976. No, there's an amazing clip. I mean, you don't really get a lot from it. Him and Yoko are watching it, and
it's John. Yeah,
John. Yeah, you don't get much sort of expression from it. It's just fascinating because he must have been thinking, "Who the hell's that guy there?" Let me ask you a 1963 question. Do you think John Lennon was kind of an angry young man even back then, or do you think it's 63 in a very general way? Do you think he was a bit happier, or?
I think that John Lennon in 1963, even at that point in his life, was a volcano trapped in ice. And by that I mean that he was prone to moments of bad behaviour. He did have a chip in his shoulder due to obviously tragic personal circumstances. And at the same time, he's the guy who's driving the bus. There's considerable pressure on him. He's also on the cusp of becoming a father at a very young age, the age of 22. And mixed in with that is the impetuosity of youth, shall we say. I mean, I do think that maybe on occasions you had to walk on eggshells around him. But having said that, as I say, you have to factor in his ubiquitous talent.
Yeah, we'll get to a couple of occasions that probably most people know about. Obviously, the one in June is very, very famous, but there's one in April as well. I'm going to somewhat defend him, as I've done on this podcast. It's not necessarily defend it, but kind of explain it, but we'll get there. Anyway, so what we decided to do, I asked you, and I've done the same, just to pick something from each month, a talking point, an incident, whatever it is. So January, if you don't mind, I'm just going to go first. You start the book with the Beatles arriving back from Hamburg. A friend of mine, Scott, has a wonderful podcast called Rainbow Valley, and he did an episode about the Big Freeze, which I didn't really know about, or maybe I kind of knew it, but I'd forgotten about it. There was this incredible, a freeze in England that happened between 62 and 63 that winter. On the 3rd of January, they play a venue called the Two Red Shoes, which, regardless of the venue, is a fantastic name. And then they play to less than 20 people on the 4th of January. How was that Scotland tour? I mean, presumably it was more successful than the 1961, but how glamorous or unglamorous was it, that tour?
It's definitely unglamorous. To add some context to it, I always think context is king. You mentioned the weather. I mean, the entire UK was carpeted in ice from December to, would you believe, March. It was extraordinary circumstances. I mean, up here, Jimmy Greaves used to call it, Antony, Chilly Jocko Land. And so you can imagine that in the north of Scotland, it's already cold, but when you've got really severe sub-zero temperatures, it's even worse. But, the interesting thing for me is that they had obviously played outside Liverpool and Hamburg. They'd actually been to Scotland before.
Oh, yeah, of course.
But the difference this time, there's a much more professional sheen to them. They've got the suits, the leathers have gone because Brian wants to smarten them up, compromises all round, and they arrive up in the north of Scotland in this terrible weather. The first gig, I think it was in Keith, is called off. Again, to provide some context, this is all taking place a matter of days, maybe a week or so before Please Please Me, the single, is released. Yeah. So, to try and give people a kind of snapshot of where we are. And they played, and the one that always sticks out for me, Antony, is the gig that they played in a town called Strathpeffer near Dingwall. It's hard to explain to people just how small this particular place is. I mean, it's remote. It's almost like a hamlet. And according to Beatles folklore, there were around 19 people watched them in this gig. And if you can imagine, it must have been quite disheartening for them. But, they always showed a fantastic sense of professionalism and adhere to Brian's mantra that the show must always go on. So I don't think that would have fazed them in the slightest. They might quite have enjoyed the fact it was so intimate in a sense. But the interesting thing is that on the same night, another local band is playing the town hall. I think the band were called the Mellatones.
Yes, I was reading that today, actually. Yes.
There are 1,000 kids in this hall ripping up trees for this much more popular band. Yeah. So, as I say, 10, 12 days before Please Please Me comes out, the Beatles are playing to an audience of around 19 people. And it's just remarkable to think how things changed in a relatively short space of time.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you got something else for January?
What else have I got for January? Well, I think the other thing to remember about January is, are they not coming together to start the Helen Shapiro tour? Is that not coming into play in January?
I think that's January, yes. Obviously, it's early. This is one of those situations where the author has to check his own book there, folks.
Listen, I've forgotten more than I knew. Brian was very much a man who thought that the diary had to be full. So, it was absolutely essential that they played as many gigs as they can. And also radio exposure is quite important. Television exposure is quite important. Television is really a medium then in 1963, which is still relatively in its infancy. But there were some very interesting television programmes that they played, such as Thank Your Lucky Stars or Granada's People and Places. And all that exposure is very important to try get some traction with as many people as possible. I mean, the touring conditions are very sparse. They're in the back of a van, and the story about, all piled on top of each other to become Beatles sandwiches.
Beatles sandwich, yeah.
I mean, I think you have to put yourself in their shoes, and it's quite exciting. Although the conditions are horrendous, it's quite exciting to consider yourself to be a touring band, as it were. I mean, it's interesting as well that in the north of Scotland, they were billed as the Love Me Do Boys to try and get some marketing traction from the first single. And they weren't completely unknown because they had been played on the radio. They did an appearance on Scottish television on the way back down. They were cheeky enough to ask for extra money, but they didn't get it. So, as I say, it's another staging post, but I think the thing to remember is how sparse and Spartan their situation was in January 1963. I mean, I'm always thinking that 1969 was annus horribilis, But 1963 is Annus Mirabilis, and January is the first step on that road.
Yeah, a couple of things that leap out from what you just said as well. There were a couple of occasions you put in the book, I can't remember which month it is, where they literally go all the way from the north to the south, maybe London or wherever it was, to do a 5-minute radio spot and then go all the way back up north. And we got all these stories about punching out the windscreen. I don't know if that's true. Actually, I had a question. I don't know if you know this, but how many motorways were there in England in 1963? Was it just the M1 or...
I think maybe just the M1, maybe the M6. And the state of the roads would have been almost Romanesque. So, you're having to go around a lot of back roads, tiny villages to get to where you want to go to. That helped to solidify their bonds, not just as a band, but as friends.
Of course, yeah.
And again, it's important to remember that Ringo's still the new kid in the block, and those moments were important to help him become a bona fide member of the band and to establish good relations. So I think it was an important learning curve.
Yeah, but there's a really interesting parallel, because if you look at their US touring schedule in certainly 64, not only were they herring around all over the place, and obviously in America they're covering massive amounts compared to England, massive amounts of travelling, but they all seem to be dotted around in all these weird places. And the thing I loved some of the details, because I didn't really know too many details about 63 tours. It's not only that they're travelling a lot and doing all these one-night stands, but they seem to be dotted around the country. They don't seem to be moving in a logical way. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like putting the tail on the donkey touring,
Yeah.
There didn't seem to be any great conceptual thinking behind it. It's just that whoever books, one night they could be in Leeds in Yorkshire, and then the next day they're back over to their own patch in Manchester, Liverpool, then to Wales, then back across down to Kent. It didn't seem to faze them in the slightest. The one thing you have to say about the Beatles is that in these early days they had an incredible work ethic. Epstein's mantra was, he would never break a deal, he would never cancel an engagement unless he had to, and there were very few postponements, 1 or 2 in 63, but not that many, considering the grueling schedule that they had to stick to. They obviously loved it. But you need a lot of energy. As a young guy, you need a lot of energy to keep that going.
When you look at it from this vantage point, it all seems very romantic. And that's one of the things I love about the Beatles, is that, okay, they didn't come from grinding poverty, but this thing about John Lennon being middle class is kind of true, but they came from a working class city. But it's all this thing about, it seems romantic now, doesn't it? They're very earthy. They're coming from not much. If we move to February, one of the things I was interested in, February the 11th is the famous day. Is it 585 minutes? I think Mark Lewison called it.
That's right.
585 most productive minutes in the history of rock. I didn't realise, was that more or less their only day off that month?
Yeah, when Brian and George Martin were talking about it, Brian's leafing through his diary, and George Martin's quite insistent that given the reception that Please Me had received, it's a slow burn ascent to the top. It's not as if it suddenly is released one week and then it's top of the charts next week. It was a slow burn ascent, but he could see that there was momentum building. So, of course, the obvious thing is to get these guys into the studio. Let's record a quick-fire album. Nobody thinks this is going to last, really. So get them down. We're not going to commit too much money. And Brian looked at his diary and said, well, I can give you them on February the 11th, but we would need to cancel the gig the night before. And he was going to square that with the promoter, who I think probably was Arthur Howes. So, yeah, the rock up at EMI Studios in Abbey Road.
Yeah, and of course, as they famously said in the Ruttles, their first album was recorded in half an hour, and the second one was even quicker. Yes, I like to slip a Ruttles reference in every now and again. We were just recording a show about 1967, and when we were talking about albums, I had to mention Sergeant Rutter's Only Dance Club Band.
It's absolutely magnificent, isn't it? Magnificent.
Yeah, I love it. Did you find out anything about that day that you didn't know before? We know they famously worked through their lunch break, didn't they? Or George Martin went for a pint. And was there anything that...
Yeah, it was just recollections from speaking to people who were there, like engineers that were still around. The problem is, of course, the march of time is relentless. So you're hoping to maybe speak to them and, again, just provide some context to it. But I think the overriding opinion is, as you say, how hard they worked. They worked through their lunch. And, there's a couple, like every Beatles story, there's some contradictions, and stories become legends and legends become myths. And Alan Smith from one of the music papers, he insists that it was his decision for them to record Twist and Shout at the end, whereas others, they're saying that was never the case. It was always planned that they would do Twist and Shout at the end. So, you know, trying to get a definitive version of history and shifting sands can be quite tricky. The date itself is obviously historic. It should also be remembered, although they recorded the first album, they did have 4 tracks already in the can.
So they did 10, didn't they? And then they did Hold Me Tight and then didn't use it.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's not to take away from anything. And obviously Lennon's tour de force vocal for Twist and Shout. And it's interesting to try and find other fresh reactions to it. And you know, the 4 guys who were there, they know how hard they worked. And McCartney said that John really worked his socks off, but he'd reached the end of his rope. You know, you've got the glass of milk flecked with blood because of the strain in his vocal cords. But it's a tour de force moment, a pivotal moment in their career, certainly, you know.
Yeah, I think the chances of someone discovering a secret videotape of someone having recorded that version, recorded on video, them doing Twist and Shout, unfortunately, I don't think we'll ever see that. But we've got the audio. And I mean, it is just, I remember when I was 13, 14, first becoming a Beatles fan, mid to late 80s. And I like a lot of 80s music now. I've kind of grown to like it. But when I first heard Twist and Shout, I thought, I've never conceived of anyone singing that way. And it's not just John, of course, it's a live performance, isn't it? They did it one take, the whole band. But I think that's the first maybe classic Beatles image in the studio, and there were a few over the years. But, you know, him stripped to the waist, and Norman Smith said they were, I think you had it in your book as well, yeah, drinking milk, sucking Zoobs or whatever it was, and smoking Stuyvesant cigarettes at the same time. It's a nice bookend as well, because you've got obviously Paul starting it off with the 1, 2, 3, 4, and yeah, it works nicely.
The other thing I always take from recording that album, and we'll talk about the album maybe in a minute or so, but
yeah, sure.
I saw her standing there for me as the moment that the 60s really starts. It's the sound of a jet in the runway, blasting down that runway, that raucous intro, 1, 2, 3, 4, bang. The album still retains a lot of freshness for me, you know.
Oh, I like it. I was just going to ask you, it really holds up, doesn't it?
I think it does actually hold up.
Yeah, it's brilliant.
That magnificent first track. And they sing it so well. They just sound so good. I mean, I know a lot of, they were playing these tracks, some of these covers in Hamburg. So, you know, they're battle hardened and they're game ready. But that's not to take away from what is one of the great staging posts in the history of popular music.
Absolutely. I think when you listen to the album, because I did listen to both those first 2 albums in preparation for this. I mean, obviously, recording-wise, it doesn't sound as polished. I mean, obviously, Abbey Road sounds way more polished, and you know, they were better musicians by '69. But it works in its favour because it's very raw. It sounds quite trebly, like you don't really get the bass. We know that you didn't really hear the bass properly till maybe '66. But do you know, Ken, there was something that's been hiding in plain sight all these years that I hadn't even noted. That, of course, 3 years later, when they made Revolver, how does the first track of that start? 1, 2, 3, 4. So they've gone from 1, 2, 3, 4 to this sort of slow, sort of slightly stoned 1, 2. And I'd never registered that. It's so stupid of me. It's been hiding there all these years. You know.
Sometimes we just don't see these things. I mean, it's almost like a languid, smoky version of it.
Yeah, you just notice these little things, don't you? And they've been there all this time.
An Archimedes moment for you, Antony.
Yes, that's it, yeah, of many, yes. Have you picked anything else from February before we move on?
No, we can move on.
Okay. I think March was when it was released. I wanted to just talk again, just a little bit more about this touring thing. Now, one of my favourite bits of the anthology was, do you remember when they play There's a Place and they list off all the places that they toured? And you've got an image of a van going down the motorway. I guess we've already covered that. I just love that image. You know, was February a one-off, or did they basically never have any days off any of these months? I mean, what would be their average? What's the average number of days off they'd get a month?
The average number of days off in a calendar month could be 2. You know, I mean, you've got, in about February, you've got the Helen Shapiro tour, the first UK tour, and she's quite a big star. It has to be said, Well, I should qualify that. She's a big star, but that star's on the wane. And, and all of a sudden these 4 young guys come in and the change is quite dramatic. And she recognised that, that this is the coming storm, as it were. And the audience reaction just illustrated that.
Well, I wanted to ask you, again, as a sort of general thing at the beginning of the year, so you've got obviously Chris Montez and various others. How did they react to being upstage, were they quite magnanimous? Did they sort of realise, you've got to go with what the crowd wants? Or
well, in terms of Chris Montez and Tommy Rowe, and again, just for context, Tommy Rowe and Chris Montez were the headliners for this tour. And, they were quite established stars, although, again, they've had their moment in the spotlight. But they're still quite well known. Chris Montez was known for, I think the song was Let's Dance. But years earlier. Tommy Rowe was Sheila.
Which the Beatles did in Hamburg, we know.
In Hamburg, I hope.
Yes, I think they did, yes.
They come with a bit of a pedigree. But once again, they're blown away by this growing audience reaction to these four young guys. It must have been quite awkward to begin with, and I think there was a bit of tension between the two Americans and obviously the Beatles. But you'd have to be pragmatic, and reality would have to kick in. Who's getting the most reaction and who's putting the bums in seats? Well, at this point, even at this early point, it's not Chris Montez and Tommy Rowe. There were some moments of tension, especially after a gig. I think it was after Newcastle. Please Please Me had, I know there's a dispute over whether it was a number one or not, but it was certainly in that top two number one bracket. And when that went to the top of the charts, as you can expect with four young guys, let off some steam, had a bit of a party. Everybody had a bit too much to drink. Chris Montez goes back to the tour bus to sleep it off. And of course, the next thing he knows is the sensation of wet beer being poured over his face. And he looks up to see John Lennon standing over him. Typical John, these are young guys. There's a bit of cabin fever. It's not a huge surprise that they got up to high jinks. But young Chris Montez, who was quite a pugnacious American-Mexican, really didn't take it lying down. And he and Lennon were soon involved in, as we say up in Glasgow, really, it was more like handbags than it is actually boxing gloves.
Fisticuffs, maybe? Or
fisticuffs, yeah.
Yeah. I've forgotten about that. They had a fight. Well, they kind of had a fight. Yeah, I've forgotten about that.
They had a kind of a fight. Tommy Rowe obviously had to have his compatriots back. But, George Harrison recalls how they were booed off stage a couple of times, and he felt sorry for them. But Beatlemania was coming round the corner.
Yeah, just by the way, John Lennon had a bit of form for pouring beer over people's heads, because there's two occasions I can think of the top of my head. They played a wedding in about 1958, and I think there was a middle-aged woman who was, I don't know, mouthing off or acting up, and John Lennon poured a full pint of beer over a middle-aged lady's head. And then in 1962, after Stuart Sutcliffe's death, Lennon was behaving pretty wildly. He did the same to Brian Epstein when he was over in Hamburg. As I said, we just did a show about 62, and I was doing some research. After Sutcliffe died, he really went off the rails. I think Richard Buskin, you may have heard of, him and Eric Taros, they did a podcast called Lennon's Original Lost Weekend.
Oh, right.
Because essentially, it was the same kind of behaviour. And there were little glimpses. Well, more than a glimpse. We'll get to that, I promise, in a second when we get to the month. But with the Please Please Me album, as you said, it was released in March. What are your favourites other than, the really famous ones? Obviously, as you said, they'd already recorded the singles. Any other gems from that album?
I like Misery. I think it's very bluesy. I like the story as well about whether Helen Shapiro was offered it or not through a back channel with her producer, Norrie Paramore. Lennon McCartney especially saw themselves more as a songwriting cooperative. They thought there was money in being songwriters and flogging your own material to other artists. But I like the whole album. There's not that much on it that I think has weathered badly over the years, has fared badly. I just think it's a magnificent tour de force. Please Please Me, I think, stands up very well.
Just leaps out, doesn't it? That's their first classic single for me, and it was only their second single, so it's a good start.
It's got great vivacity to it, and it really is the one song that maybe kickstarts the whole domino effect.
Yeah, definitely. I'm the wrong person to ask, because there's very few Beatles songs I don't like, honestly. I know it's a bit of a popular opinion, but I would say the side B of Beatles for Sale is a little bit weak for me. But still some good songs. But yeah, I like Chains. I love how young George sounds. He's got much more of a thick Scouse accent, hasn't he? Because the other thing about them is how much their voices changed over the years, wasn't it?
Yeah, Chains is an excellent track. The whole album for me works. There's not, nowadays if you wanted to skip a track, I don't skip any of it. I think it's there a natural and cohesive whole.
I don't know, maybe Boys I would skip, but even then, Ringo gets his track. But Anna, if we just focus on John Lennon for a sec, Anna is a wonderful You know, that vocal, especially in the middle eight, you know, all of my life.
The thing about John was he put his own stamp on all these covers. It's interesting that their love of black music and Tamla Motown shines through, really. And they treat all these songs with such a reverence. We mentioned Twist and Shout earlier on, but you know, how many people out there think that Twist and Shout is a bona fide Beatles song when in fact it's a cover? But that just illustrates perfectly how they could take these songs and put their own stamp on them.
I mean, Baby It's You is fantastic as well. There's a Place is always a big one. I think There's a Place is an example where people say that's a John song. Again, you know, a lot of people say in the Many Years for Now book he's trying to take credit, but, you know, I mean, he was there at the end of the day. Right, April. So this is I just highlighted again because we're John Lennon centric here. They meet Jane Asher. John infamously asks her, you know, how women masturbate, and Paul ends up obviously going off with her. I don't know if it was that evening. Yeah, but they become an item. Now, this is kind of funny because you were actually on Glass Onion a couple of years ago. I don't know if you remember this. Not in person, but do you remember I did a listener audio questions episode?
I remember, yeah.
And you sent in a question. So what I'm going to do here is turn the tables on you because you asked me a question while you were preparing this book.
Good evening, folks. This is Ken McNab speaking with his voice from Scotland. I've been doing some research for a possible new project, and it strikes me that in early 1963, especially on the night that the Beatles first met Jane Asher, and 2 months later on at Paul McCartney's 21st birthday party, John Lennon's behaviour was absolutely lamentable. He was like a social hand grenade. And the question is, why do people think that Paul was prepared to tolerate John's occasionally appalling conduct? You know, what was the unique quality that held them together through so many different controversies? Okay, over to you.
So I don't know if I helped. Hopefully I did.
Oh, no, you did. Absolutely.
Yeah, your question was about why did Paul tolerate John's behaviour? Ghosty and I, between us, we kind of said, well, it was partly to do with ambition and partly to do with a brotherly bond. But why do you think, how do you think Paul felt about it, and why do you think he stuck with him?
Privately he would have been seething, but it's an interesting thing that, you know, we could speculate about what his reaction really was, but you know something, he's never criticised John for that kind of conduct, and much as I love John, but it's hard to excuse, even if you are young and off the leash and on the lash, as it were.
Yeah,
I've often wondered, and we'll come on to McCartney's birthday party as well.
Yeah.
To be fair to Paul McCartney, he gave John a lot of latitude over the years. I mean, Jane Asher's 16 or 17, but maybe you have to take, with John, you have to take the good, the bad and the ugly as part of his whole personality. And I'm quite sure there were times when Paul did rein him in as part of that special bond that they had together.
From my, if call it research if you want, from doing this podcast, it does seem that like virtually all the terrible stories you hear about John Lennon, both the provable ones and the speculative ones, they all do seem to involve alcohol. There's not that many stories of him being sober and behaving badly.
Yeah, I mean, you know, people who witnessed this kind of conduct up close and personal, like Billy J. Kramer, various people in Liverpool from various bands, they all come to the same conclusion that John was a terrible drunk.
Yes. Would you agree that there's not really that many terrible stories when he's sober? Maybe, you know, he's a bit edgy, a bit spiky.
Maybe it's just a defence mechanism. There's a lot of insecurity there. And, you know, we've all had these moments when we were younger where you needed a couple of drinks for some Dutch courage and whatever circumstances. It does seem to have been maybe that kind of light switch moment where if he has one drink too many, then he becomes, Dr. Jekyll becomes Mr. Hyde.
I mean, that's just a perfect way to put it. Yeah, that's it. It's Jekyll and Hyde. I actually had a therapist on the show about 3 years ago, and, you know, he made it clear he didn't want to diagnose John Lennon because he never met him. And so much of it is speculative, and he was humble enough to say that, the therapist guy. And he said, you know, alcohol does seem to bring out demons, you know, whereas other things like obviously marijuana and LSD, you might get weird behaviour, but you're probably not going to get that sort of cruel behaviour. Because there's other stories. I think this is from '62. They were on a barge or a ferry, or it was one of those ones. And he apparently, some girl had her fingers not trapped in the door, but in the hinge of the door. and he whacked the door to trap her fingers. So you hear all these horrible stories, and Goldman had one about him putting some girl's hand in a fire or something. I mean, that probably wasn't true, but yeah, I think there was that cruel thing, wasn't there?
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's just a case that beers made him boorish and marijuana made him mellow.
I think also, I mean, one of his not great lyrics was, I've got a chip on my shoulder that's bigger than my feet.
I got a chip on my shoulder that's bigger than my feet.
You know, it's not a great line, is it? But it's interesting that he says that, and I think that's true, as you said earlier. Yeah, it's a chip on the shoulder. Okay, what else have we got here? Have you got anything else from April?
Yeah, well, I think, for me, actually, it's just an interesting mental snapshot of this band, which is, I say, there's a bit of a momentum building. Please Please Me, the album and the single, both at top around about this time. And, they're playing to sell-out audiences. They've been on a tour with 2 established American stars. In the midst of all this fervour and growing excitement, where does Brian have them playing? A public school.
Oh, of course, Stowe, isn't it?
And really a bastion of elitism and educational and privilege. I did get caught out with Stowe, I have to say. But the thing for Stowe is I spoke to a photographer who was there. Again, I think it's important when you do these projects to try and speak to people so that you've got your own input into it. You're not just trying to rehash something. This was his first introduction to them, and over time built up quite a warm relationship with him as his career began to grow. And it was fascinating listening to him about how they interacted with the staff. I mean, if you can imagine driving up in this battered old van to this tree-lined avenue and this beautiful building with all the colonnades, and you can feel the privilege oozing out of every piece of brickwork. And they go inside, and everybody's charmed by them. I mean, we talked about the working class element of them. They get a tour of the school, and then they play their gig for an audience of boys. And I don't think the school had ever seen anything quite like it. But to me, it's just the bizarre juxtaposition of playing in a cinema or a hall for maybe upwards of 1,500 people, and all of a sudden you're playing in a school hall for privately educated pupils. And it didn't faze them in the slightest. They just, again, the mantra was that we'll play anywhere. Brian had struck a deal with one of the pupils in January, and once they had got all the legality sorted, then the gig was on. And the tape's very interesting, one for Peter Jackson to look at.
Pretty rocking, isn't it? I mean, they rock it out.
I was able to check exactly what the set list was, because again there was a lot of contradiction, and nobody was quite sure what songs they actually did play, but they sound great. And apparently the school loved them. Pupils who were there, one or two that I spoke to, and the photographers said it was one of the greatest days of their lives. I mean, it just, and they weren't all sitting there, sitting on their hands with their school ties on. I mean, quite a few of them were rocking out as much as the headmaster, head teacher would allow. And I was lucky enough to get some pictures that hadn't been published before of that concert. So that always helps to illustrate, when you get pictures that have either not been seen or have rarely been seen, then that makes it a bit more attractive.
And what was the audience there? Were we talking, was that a couple of hundred? Or
a couple of hundred, yeah. I think the tickets were something like 20 pence a shot. I can't remember offhand. It was actually David Moores was the pupil who set the ball rolling, and he was part of the famous Moores family from Liverpool.
The Pools. Yes.
Yeah. He was very much an ambitious young guy. He'd seen them in the Cavern in December and thought, well, why can't I get them to play at my school? So it did take a bit of chutzpah, respect and kudos to him for actually seeing it through, and to the school for agreeing to host them, really.
And I like that 1963 Beatles as well. There's the Swedish show we may mention later on.
Yeah.
I like it because it's a nice blend of polished but still quite raw, And obviously 64, 65 is great as well, but they're playing all their own songs. I like these sort of mix of originals, and when they're doing Soldier of Love and Genoa is the Lover. That's why I love the radio. I mean, I'd love to go on a tangent about the radio shows, but they obviously, live at the BBC when it came out, was just fabulous.
Soldier of Love remains.
Oh, I love it.
Not the lost classic, but certainly the lost single.
I mean, at least we've got it, though, haven't we? At least we've got a fairly polished recording of it, even if we haven't got an EMI one. Ken, I have to admit, I told you this earlier, someone called me while I was researching today. I haven't got anything for May, so would you like to take May and then we'll get on to
Yeah, I'll tell you what.
Paul's 21st birthday?
I'll tell you what for me is interesting about May. We shouldn't neglect the music, but there are all these centrifugal forces pulling in all sorts of different directions. And May, of course, is the month of Brian and John going on holiday together. Now, I've given this some thought actually over the years, and you must remember that the two principals here are no longer able to tell their truth, as it were. But if I was to look at it from a sort of take a helicopter view of it, Antony, it seems to me that this was really a dangerous liaison, no matter what happened or didn't happen. It's a dangerous liaison for a number of reasons, but principally because you have to put things in the context of the time. And I've tried with this book to set the book to take into account the tsunami of political, social and cultural change that's happening in 1963, from Profumo, Kennedy, civil rights and lots of things taking place in the background. But in that particular month, when Brian and John decide to go on holiday, it's a dangerous liaison that could easily have destroyed the Beatles.
Yeah, very weird, isn't it? It's very strange.
Yeah, you must remember that homosexuality is illegal in the UK and is punishable by being sent to prison. So, it's very much kept in the margins and the dark shadows, and whether people think it was a closet homosexuality with Brian or not, those people around him were more than aware of his own homosexuality and of his feelings towards John. It's an open secret. And the one person who did know about it and really was looking through the cracks in his fingers was Tony Barrow, the press officer. And Tony is more than aware, even allowing for the fact that at that point the mainstream media has got zero interest in the Beatles because, Fleet Street's made up of crusty old hacks who are left over from 15 years earlier from the Second World War. And they're not really interested in popular music, They were interested in Sinatra and, to a degree, Elvis, but that ship sailed and, the Beatles hardly flickered on the radar. But Tony Barrow was sussed enough to know that at that point, if the lead singer of Britain's chart-topping band is going abroad on holiday with his homosexual manager, there's enough of a whiff of scandal there in the air to interest not the music guys, but those foot-in-the-door news journalists, the real bruisers, if you like, who'll stop nothing. And there's enough there to tempt them. And had that story appeared in a Fleet Street tabloid newspaper at the time, it really would have been a serious situation for them. It could have been the death knell of the Beatles, that kind of scandal surrounding them. Even in 1963, Tony Barrow was sitting there, as I say, with his heart in his mouth, really, waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for that moment when he picks up the phone and it's some Fleet Street bruiser asking him, is it true that... ... But you know what happened, Antony? The call never came. They dodged that bullet, but it could have been very serious.
Yeah, funny enough, in 1970, John Lennon showed he was different from a lot of rock stars where they try and play down their more negative traits. He played them up and he made it out that essentially they went on holiday as soon as the baby was born. But that I saw from your book, that's obviously not true because Julian was born in April and they went in May. But yeah, it's very strange. I think, people can speculate forever about it, what, if anything happened between them. But I think the issue of them just going on holiday is weird enough. And Paul, as we know, said it was a power play, and who the hell knows?
There can't be any doubt that within the Beatles' inner circle and beyond that, when Brian and John go on holiday together, you can hear the sound of Pandora's box creaking open all over Liverpool. Because people, it's human nature, people gossip. But again, we touched on Paul's reaction to John's behaviour earlier on. By the same token, none of the three other Beatles, who all went to Tenerife, incidentally, while John was in mainland Spain, you never hear them talking about it. Not one of them has ever mentioned really the nitty-gritty of did they or didn't they. And anyway, who cares? John liked to shock and maybe, embroider what may or may not have happened with the likes of Pete Shotton. But at the end of the day, there's so much time has passed. Nobody cares. But I agree with you. It was a very strange decision. And he admitted it himself that it was selfish to leave Cynthia at home with the baby. One minute she's acquiescing to it and giving it her blessing. Another occasion in print, she said that she was a bit disappointed. Again, who really knows? But it was a strange decision. Maybe it was a power play, once again, trying to underscore the fact that he was the leader in this band. But you'd think that by that time, Brian would know fine who was the leader in the band.
Yeah, it's very strange. Just a quick plug for a film with Ian Hart as John Lennon called The Hours and Times that I've referenced. It's not about it being true or him even looking like John Lennon necessarily, but it's a very good sort of art film. Ian Hart played him in Backbeat, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, I really love that film. It's got lovely Spanish music. Yeah, I forgot to say, back in 2019, you and I nearly met in Madrid because I was just leaving Spain at that time, and you went to Madrid for the tennis, didn't you? Because we're both tennis fans. Yeah, anyway. All right, so let's get on to June. If I look around the room, there's a big elephant in the corner, and it's Paul McCartney's 21st birthday, which obviously segues nicely from what we're talking about. You may know, Ken, that on Glass Onion we talk about this Coleman and Goldman thing, and Coleman obviously gives the nice version. Albert Goldman has John Lennon picking up a shovel and commencing to beat Bob Wooler to death. John did actually say, and I think you quoted this in your book, in the Andy Peebles interview from the 6th of December 1980, which is the nice interview, which is a very charming John Lennon.
The Beatles' first national coverage was me beating up Bob Wooler at Paul's 21st party because he intimated I was homosexual. So I must have had a fear that maybe I was a homosexual to attack him like that. And it's very complicated reasoning. But I was very drunk and I hit him. And I could have really killed somebody then. And that scared me. Paul was 21, so I must have been 23 then. And that was in the Daily Mirror. It was the back page. I remember the picture. It was pretty scary. And it was a kind of rehash of my youth. So it was a kind of self-destructive suicide side of me, which is resolving itself.
Without wanting to go too much nitty-gritty, I mean, what do we know about that for sure? You know, I mean, I don't know, was it a murderous attack or was it...
I don't think it was a murderous attack. I think it was an angry attack, and it was obviously venomous. Will definitely suffered some injuries to his ribs. I don't think John held back. Again, you know, you've got that terrible toxic accelerant of alcohol involved. I feel sorry for the McCartney clan because, you know, this was obviously a milestone moment in young McCartney's life. And also he's there with his new girlfriend. It was really the first time Jane Asher had met the McCartney clan, and nobody could throw a party like the McCartneys. So, you know, there's a lot of pride involved in it. And yet here again, weeks after he first meets Jane, there's John.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, Jane Asher must have had a very strange view of John Lennon, because that's two things. I wonder if he was even acting up because he was a bit jealous. I mean, there's always that aspect, isn't there? I mean, Backbeat, they kind of, again, I know it's fiction to some extent, but they intimate that he was jealous because with Stu and Astrid. Maybe he was jealous, you know, probably fancied Jane Asher, didn't he? Why wouldn't he?
Well, why wouldn't he? It's entirely possible. There's an interesting postscript to that particular incident, is that Bob Wooler went to a well-known local Liverpool solicitor who I think was called Rex Macon.
Yes, he was Brian Epstein's lawyer, yeah.
There was a bit of a conflict of interest, but he was able to sort of broker a settlement between Wooler and Lennon. It's interesting. Obviously, Don Short at the Daily Mirror, he got wind of it, and that was the Beatles' really first proper national press, where, as I said, there was a whiff of scandal attached to them. The language is awfully polite when you read it in the newspapers and the cuttings and what was said at the time. And of course, the fact is, when you read Lennon's comments in his alleged apology, they were clearly not written by John in the slightest. They were clearly written by Tony Barrow and or Brian Epstein.
Yeah, sorry I socked you, said Beatle John. It was something like that, wasn't it?
Sorry I socked you, yeah.
I think it was that, wasn't it? Yeah. Can I just tell you and the listeners a couple more things about that? I've got a fabulous book by Mike McCartney called Remember. It's just got some wonderful period pictures of the early Beatles. And he's got quite a lot of photos from that night. And there's a couple of interesting details. Hank Marvin and Bruce Welch were both there. Uncle Albert was there, who was immortalised in the song. Because it was Auntie Gin's house, wasn't it? And
yeah,
he had Uncle Albert there. And you can see in Mike McCartney's photos, John Lennon looks like that bloke who's getting a bit pissed. And everyone around him is sort of a bit, you know, he's just got that look about him. He hasn't done anything yet, but the photos are all pre the incident, because I guess the party kind of broke up after that, didn't it? But the other thing about it is that there's probably quite a few hard guys, yeah, you know, people from Liverpool bands and stuff.
Well, Billy Hatton, I can't remember. Billy Hatton was at the Foremost.
Billy Hatton was from the Foremost, yes.
And, you know, I don't think he was a shrinking violet. he was prepared to step in when John overstepped the mark, and I don't think he would have missed him and hit the wall. I mean, these guys from Liverpool they're all hard individuals. A lot of them have grown up on the tough side of the tracks,
Absolutely. Another little, I love the Beatle coincidences. How about this one? This is a little bit tragic because it refers to John Lennon's mother, but you know that John always thought that his mother had been killed by a drunk policeman who was off duty. The reason why he thought that, I think, was because I think it was about 3 weeks before Julia Lennon died, her boyfriend or common-law husband, Dykins, who you're sure you've heard of, Twitchy, he got in a car accident on Menlove Avenue when he was drunk, about 3 weeks before Julia died. So John, guess, was conflating those two things. But who represented John Dykins in court? Rex Makin.
Is that right?
And this is obviously before they'd met Brian Epstein, and crediting Mark Lewison again for this. But there's so many of these weird Beatles coincidences. I mean, they're just everywhere.
The layers of coincidence are astonishing, really.
Oh, I mean, it's crazy. Can I just give you another one just for a bit of fun? The John Lennon song, Hello Little Girl, which in fact the Foremost did that one.
Yeah.
At the time he wrote that, which was roughly about 1958, there was a song by Lloyd Price called Hello Little Girl in the charts. And that song contained the lyric, I want to hold your hand.
Goodness.
Yeah, that's pretty weird, isn't it? Probably about another 100 of those I could reel off, but I won't.
End of part 1.
Take this, brother. May it serve you well.